Let's start out 2023 with a new portrait painting tutorial of this woman. This painting lesson is definitely going to be on the advanced side, but like always, I'll walk you through all the techniques that I use. Now, the first tip I want to give everyone for painting better portraits is to paint larger. This canvas is 24 inches in height by 17 inches in length, and painting larger than a normal sized piece of paper, like an 8.5 by 11, is just going to give you much more room to work with. Also, it's a lot easier to hide mistakes on larger paintings. And as we all know, making mistakes and then trying to fix those mistakes is a huge part of painting. And of course, I'll go into more information about this throughout the video. So up on the left side of the screen right now is a high resolution photograph of my completed painting. And on the right side, I included a gridded version that you could use to transfer over to your canvas or to your paper. And of course, on the members page, I'll include the reference photo that I used to paint this picture. And for those of you that are interested, every portrait reference photo that I use for paintings on this channel is from Adobe stock, which I get with my Photoshop and Lightroom plan. So the first thing we're going to need to do is mix a flesh tone. Now I'm using transparent colors here. These are made by Createx Illustration Colors. So the color you're seeing on the screen right now is the mixture that I used for this portrait, and you can see right out of the bottle how dark it is. In my other portrait painting tutorials on this channel, I noticed that a lot of people seem to get confused at this point, which is completely understandable. If you're looking at this color directly from the bottle, you'd think that there's no way that this is the same color that I used for this portrait. You'd probably think you have to mix some white in it to lighten it up, but that's not the case. This color is transparent, so we're going to adjust our values, how dark and how light everything is, by how much paint we spray onto the canvas. So what I did here was add some of that same color right into my airbrush, and I'm just lightly spraying it on the paper. Remember that an airbrush atomizes and sprays paint. An airbrush doesn't directly put the paint on the surface like a paintbrush does. What it does is spray thousands and thousands of very small dots. So what's going on here is that paint and that white paper are optically mixing. So you're seeing both at the same time. And also remember that these pigments are transparent. So you're actually seeing the white paper through the paint itself. So this optical mixture of the atomized transparent paint along with the white surface that it sprays on gives us a lighter value of that initial hue. If you're new to painting and this sounds confusing or complicated, it's really not. The more you paint, the more you'll understand this, and it'll just become second nature. So let me show you how I mix this color. The first color I'm starting out with is burnt umber, and make sure you shake up your bottle really well before you start mixing these. I'm adding about 20 drops of this color to a small cup. I always like to mix it outside the airbrush. It makes it a lot cleaner and it's easier to store. The next color I'm using is scarlet. This is basically a pure red color. It does have a very subtle hint of orange to it though. And I'm going to add about half the amount as I did with the burnt umber. So let's say about 10 drops of this scarlet into this mixture. Then I'm just going to mix it up. And you'll see here that those two colors give us a very dark reddish brown mixture. Now in order to knock back some of that red, I'm going to use the complementary color to red, which is green. And with this moss green, I'm going to add about 5 to 8 drops of it. And that's going to help desaturate the color. And then in order to reduce this paint, I'm going to use some distilled water. I'm going to add about 20-25%. And then mix it up. And right here, this is the final color. You can see that it's an extremely dark color. It almost has like a chocolatey brown kind of orangish hue to it. This is going to work just fine for this portrait. And this is what the viscosity looks like of what I like to paint with. And like I said, I thin it about 20%, maybe a bit more. I drew the initial lines of this portrait using a 1x1 grid. And of course, you could use anything you like. If you want to use a grid to help you transfer it over, that's great. And if you're just learning how to draw, there's nothing wrong with printing it out and tracing it or using a projector to help you out. And I'm painting this one on a smooth canvas that I prepared myself, which is stretched over MDF board. Since I went over using grids and setting up smooth canvases in plenty of other videos, I'm not going to waste time showing you that in this one. So if you want to learn that, make sure you check out those videos. When painting a portrait, you could start anywhere you like. There's no rules for this. I like to start with the eyes. So I'm starting with the left one, and in my airbrush right now, I have the color sepia. I'm using an airbrush shield that I made myself, and I'm just trying to use the curves of this to get in some sharp lines around the eye itself, just so we can kind of set it in place. I'm placing up my completed painting on the left side of the screen so you can see what the final painting is going to look like. With my shield, I'm doing the best I can to place it around the eye and then spray into the eye to darken this whole area up because most of this eye is going to be in shadow. Now it doesn't matter what type of airbrush shield you use, even if you cut out a piece of paper with an X-Acto blade, anything will work. Just remember that no airbrush shield is going to fit a curve perfectly, so you'll see that I'm constantly moving my shields around trying to get each part of it to fit. So I'll spray a little, then I'll move the shield around and spray again. I'm switching over to my eraser here just to scratch out some paint where this specular highlight is going to be later on. I'm not concerned with detail here, I just want to map this out so I know where I'm going. In the beginning of the painting, when I'm using my shields, I'm basically just trying to use those to paint in the areas where shadows start and where they stop. I'm not trying to get everything in perfect. So I'll use my shield on an area like this part right here, which is the lower part of the iris, which separates it from the lower eyelid. And then I'll just switch back over to some freehand and then just kind of fill in the area of the eye where it's going to get darker. I always like to use a combination of shields and freehand. I always start with the shield first, just to give me that sharp line wherever I want it. And then to darken up the area around it or where the shadow is, then I switch over to freehand. I don't need to use the shield the whole time. Now, I just want to say that the earliest stages of any portrait are easily the most difficult parts. This is simply because nothing looks right yet, and it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that your painting's wrong and you'll never get it right. So what I do is try to allow myself a lot of room for error in the early stages of a painting. And I always try to remind myself that these early stages are just the building blocks for the final portrait. This is why in the beginning it's so important to not spray too much paint. You want to try to keep everything light and soft. The reason for that is it's just going to be a lot easier to erase those mistakes and adjust it as you need to. Here's a good example of this. You can see this small crease just above the eyelid right here. I accidentally painted this in too long, and I want to point out that I switched over to the flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of this video. So with this flesh tone in my airbrush, I'm just working around the eye, darkening up some areas. I'm going to darken up the right corner here where we get close to the tear duct. Just spray some paint in there. And then I'm going to spray some paint underneath the eye where we're getting this shadow. And the main goal here is really just to paint in values. Anything that's dark, I just want to kind of get some tone and some value in there. I'm not concerned with anything advanced like skin texture. And now as I move up to this crease above the upper eyelid with that flesh tone, I'm still spraying in more paint and defining areas. And on the right side here, I noticed that I made a mistake. So as I was painting this in right here, I was looking at my reference photo and realized that I just painted this in way too long. It's going too far over to the right, to the nose. But the good news is that I painted this in pretty light and there's no paint behind it. So really easy to fix. All I need to do is switch over to my eraser and erase it right out. And this is what I was talking about in the beginning of the video. When a painting is larger, you just have so much more room to work. So when I erase this out, you don't even really notice there was a mistake there. It's easier to hide in the final painting. So at this point, I'm pretty comfortable with the placement of everything. So with that flesh tone, I'm just going to go over these areas, some with the shield and then a bit freehand, just darken everything up to really set it in place. And at this point where I'm adding a fair amount of paint, now it's going to be very difficult to remove this if there's a mistake in there. So again, always start light, kind of get everything in place, adjust it as you need. And then once you feel like it's in the right place, then commit more paint to it. So now that we have some paint underneath the eye and around it, let's switch over to the eraser and start adding in some skin texture. I'm going to put up my completed painting again on the left side of the screen so we can see what we're working towards. So with my painting on the right side of the screen right now, to me, it just looks too smooth. It has kind of that airbrush look where everything is so soft. The easiest way for me to break up this smooth look is going right over to that eraser. So I'm using my ink eraser into the bright areas, scratching out some paint, and then in the shadows, I'm just using some pressure, again, just to break up some of it so it's not one solid continual tone. Not only am I using the eraser to add some texture in here, but I'm also lightening this area up so that this part of this lower eyelid looks like it's protruding a little bit, and then that darker shadow right underneath is going to look like it's moving away from us. And when someone's laughing or smiling, like this woman is, generally what happens is our eyes tend to squint and our eyebrows raise. So her lower eyelid is actually going over a part of her eye, causing the lower part of it to protrude out. So again, I just want to make sure that I get this area in. I have that light area in the right place. Obviously right now this is way too bright, but that's okay. We'll add some more paint to it later and set everything in the right place. As we move along over to the nose, I just put some paint there to define the ridge of it. And then I'm scratching in a few lines to make it look like some of the skin is wrinkling there as she's lifting her eyebrow up. And this is pretty simple. I'm just scratching out some horizontal lines. Once those are erased out, then I go right back over to the airbrush, spray over it. Now I'm not going to be using the skin texture template that I use for a lot of paintings on this one. I'm just going to do this in freehand, spray around the eye here to darken up some values, and then go back to that eraser to pull out some textures. But for this area right underneath the eye, what I'm going to do is spray in some texture freehand. So these textures here are going to be pretty soft because there's no shield being used. And the way I paint these is basically just pull back on the trigger a very small amount to get some paint, and then I just kind of bounce it around. So this part of the video is in real time, and you'll see just how slow I go when I'm trying to put down some texture like this. Again, I'm just lightly pulling back on the trigger. You can see my finger there. It's barely even going back. And then I'm just kind of bouncing the front of the airbrush across the surface to get some small soft dots. When you're adding in some subtle skin texture like this, there's no need to rush. You want to go slow. And one thing I really like to do is just stop and then walk back from my painting maybe a few feet and just look at the painting from a distance and see how it looks and decide what I need to adjust. And one thing you always have to be aware of when painting with an airbrush is that overspray is always going to get on some areas that you don't want. So you'll see me here cleaning up that little specular highlight within the eye, and I'll go back to that multiple times throughout this painting, just because as I'm spraying around the eye, some paint is going to get on there, so I'll have to go back and clean it up. Before I go any further with the paint, I just want to clean up and brighten up some areas. So I'm going over to my eraser here and lightening some things up, like this lower eyelid, just a bright highlight along the right side of it. And I'll just work my way around the eye, brightening up a few areas. And I'm not making any of this up as I'm doing it. Remember, I'm always looking at my reference. That's going to be my guide. So if I see something that's brighter there and it's darker on my painting, I'll try to get them to match. Before, I used my eraser to erase out some very subtle wrinkles on the nose, and I just don't think they looked well defined, so I'm going over with a ripped piece of paper and just spraying in a few more just to give a little bit more contrast in this area. And I'll also use the ripped piece of paper along the bottom here to darken up this small shadow underneath the lower eyelid. It's in the right place here, but it's still just a bit too light, so I want to darken it up, add some more texture to it, and just kind of define the edge. Now I'm going to take this color and start adding in some of the values underneath the eye where the cheek is. And it's important for me to point out that I'm not just spraying paint randomly underneath the eye. I'm really paying attention to the reference photo and noticing the curves that I see on the cheek. Subtle highlights and subtle shadows are going to define the shape of whatever it is you're painting. So you want to make sure that you try to get these in the correct place. When the light source is basically straight on, like it is in this portrait, the brighter areas are going to look closer to us. They're going to give that illusion. And then the darker areas are going to look like they're kind of rolling away. And when those shadows and highlights are in the correct places, you get the illusion that you're going for in a painting. So for example, this shadow underneath the cheek here on the left side, where it's darker here, this part gives the illusion like it's rolling away from us, right? And then as it moves up, this area looks a little bit brighter, so it looks closer to us. And a better version of this would be the nose that you could see on the left side of the screen on my completed painting. You have that very bright highlight, almost like a specular highlight right at the center of the nose. That looks really close to us. And then that darker, deeper shadow underneath where the nostrils are looks farther away. We'll get to the nose later on in this painting, but just remember that shadows and highlights and their placement is really everything in a painting. And to me, color and textures are always secondary to the values. Now the eyelashes on the lower eyelid are very, very small, so I didn't want to use my airbrush and I thought a color pencil might be a little bit too thick. So what I tried here was using a 2H graphite pencil. Now graphite on top of paint is generally not a great idea just because graphite kind of has this shiny look, and if you look at the painting at an angle, it kind of has this sheen that the paint doesn't have itself. But since these were so small, I could sharpen this to a very sharp point, and I was able just to kind of map them in lightly. Now, I'm always experimenting in a painting, always trying different techniques, see if I could learn something new. And this worked out fine. I think in the future, I'd probably just go back to a black colored pencil. I also noticed that there's a very thin specular highlight on the lower eyelid. So instead of trying to scratch it out, I used a shield here, sprayed underneath it. That way the area below it is darker and that highlight just looks a bit brighter, more defined. Now I want to start mapping in the eyebrows before I get paint down on the forehead. So I'm switching over to the color black in my airbrush, and I'm just going to start out by spraying a few lines in here. These are going to look like softer hairs in the background, not really concerned with detail yet. And if I want these lines sharper or more defined, I'll use an X-Acto blade or an eraser and just kind of clean up the edges of each line. Another technique you could use to paint in small hairs is to take a piece of paper and just cut a very thin line in it with an X-Acto blade. That's what I'm doing here. I'm just laying this along the curve of the eyebrow, lightly spraying over it, and you can see that it works pretty well. I get some very thin lines. This technique works just fine. It gives you plenty of control and very sharp lines. For me, it's just a bit slow, so I'm going to go back to my favorite way of doing this just by using a black colored pencil and just sketching in some lines freehand. But I think it's always important to have different tools and tricks, that you could use when you need them. Because sometimes you may have to paint a very thin line and, the colored pencil won't work, or freehand is just kind of too risky. So you could use that technique of cutting out a small line in a piece of paper. It's just good to have more options. So I'm going to work my way around this, just adding some random lines in here. And again, I'm looking at the reference. I'm trying not to make this up. I'm just trying to follow the curve that I see that the eyebrow naturally flows in. Then once I have this in, I'm going to use that black in my airbrush and just spray a small amount of paint in there. I also use that black paint to slightly darken up and cool down that shadow on the left side of the eye underneath the upper eyelid. And if any of these eyelashes are too dark or too thick, you could always just use an eraser like I'm doing here and just kind of erase out in between them to lighten it up. Now I'm switching from the color black back to the flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of the video. And I'm just going to work my way around here, darkening up some of these shadows to make it look like they're kind of rounding off more. And I'm also going to start working on the forehead here. I basically just want to get some color in where I see some darker areas, mainly on the left side, just above that left eye, and on the right side. That'll give that rounded shape to the skull. I'll come back to the forehead later to add some more detail to it, some shadows and some textures. But for now, I just want to get the macro values in where I see some darker areas and some lighter areas. I want to erase a very subtle highlight just above the eyebrow, where this part of the skull slightly protrudes. Above the orbits, which are basically the eye sockets in the skull, there's a small ridge called the supraorbital ridge. It's basically the eyebrow itself, but that area usually slightly protrudes, so it generally catches some light. So what I'm doing here is using my eraser to slowly scratch out some small little lines above that eyebrow, add some texture there, but mainly to lighten it up. Of course, this is very subtle, but subtlety is kind of the key in portrait painting. So just a small highlight here is going to help raise this part, give the illusion that the eyebrow is slightly forward than the eye itself. From here, we're going to go paint the nose. I'm going to skip over the right eye. I'm just going to speed through it here because it's the exact same process as the left one. And the only colors that I used for this was sepia for the center of the eye, like the iris and the pupil, and then right over to that flesh tone to paint around the eye. I'm going back to the flesh tone that we mixed in the beginning of the video to paint in this nose. And here I'm going to do something a little different and show you a trick that could be helpful for newer painters. The darkest part of this nose is going to be the nostrils and around them where that shadow is being cast from the nose itself. So I'm starting with the shield here under the left nostril and just lightly spraying in this sharp line to define it. And I'm slowly going to work my way around this left nostril and follow the pencil lines that I have before just to define the outline of the nose. So once these lines are in and sharp, it's time to switch over to freehand and fill in the darkest area, which is below the nose. Now the tip or trick that I was just talking about is to leave your pencil lines in your drawing and maybe leave them a little bit darker than normal. If you paint in thin layers of paint like I do, you're going to be able to see your pencil lines through it. Plus the paint is transparent, so it's going to help show them a bit more. So normally I'll erase the lines like I'm doing right here, just so that when I put the paint over it, those pencil lines underneath aren't too dark. But there's nothing wrong with leaving those in and helping them guide you as you're painting. And what's great about this is that if you use your grids to get your line drawing in accurately, you're always going to have a guide to help you out. You'll see where your shadows start and stop. So if you're second guessing yourself and thinking maybe you made a mistake, you can always look at your painting closely, see those subtle lines underneath, and they'll help guide you. And I understand that there's some people who absolutely hate showing any sort of pencil line underneath their painting. I'm not one of them. I don't mind it. But if you want to get rid of them, the first thing you do is just erase them so they're extremely light. And then when you paint over it, the paint is really going to kind of blend them all together. But what really happens is when you switch over to the eraser to add some texture in, those pencil lines just erase right out and they completely disappear behind the paint. So it's up to you as a painter to decide what you want. But in my opinion, I don't think there's anything wrong with leaving some lines in just to help you out. So besides the sharp lines along the outside parts of the nose, the majority of everything on the nose itself is usually pretty soft and subtle. So I'm just using the airbrush freehand here to kind of darken up some of those curves so they roll away from us. In the center of the nose, we're going to have that very bright specular highlight. I'll be erasing that out later. So for now, I just don't want to put too much paint there. I want to keep that pretty light because it's always easier to erase a small amount of paint than a lot. And as I'm adding this paint in, I'm also kind of spraying some areas around the nose. This is just going to help me see my values as I paint in the nose itself. The next area that we need to get in that's very sharp is that right nostril. So just use a shield here and follow your pencil lines underneath. Just place this right on the pencil line itself and then spray under it where that shadow is going to be. I'll eventually switch over to a cooler tone like sepia or black to spray in the shadow just to kind of get rid of that orange flesh tone that we naturally have. But for now, using the flesh tone works pretty well. You can get it mapped in and you can get it pretty dark if you spray a fair amount of paint. Now the light source in this portrait is in the center, but it is slightly over to the right. So the right side of the nose and this right nostril is going to be a bit lighter than the left side. So I'm paying attention to that as I'm painting this in. I'm trying not to put too much paint there. I will erase into it later to lighten it up, but for now, I just want to try to keep it in pretty light. And I noticed here that I sprayed a bit too much paint along the right side here. So no problem, easy to fix. Just go back over to the eraser, which I'll do later when I pull out some highlights, and then clean that area up. At this point, I would say the majority of the values on the nose are in the correct places. So I'm going to switch over to that eraser now and then start erasing out the highlights. I'll start on the left side here, just next to the eye, to scratch out some of the highlights where those small wrinkles are. Then I'm just going to work my way down along the nose using a very mild amount of pressure, just small little circular motions, enough to remove a very thin layer of paint. And as I said earlier, the nose right here has one of the brightest highlights on this painting. So I'll get that one in and then use that as a reference to erase out these highlights around it. Now, as I'm erasing here, I'm pulling out a lot of these a bit too bright, but that's normal. That's usually what happens when you erase. When it's too bright, all I need to do is go back to that flesh tone later on and glaze it over the top. But what I'm getting here is I'm getting a good amount of texture onto the nose. The nose is one of the few areas on the face that generally has a good amount of texture to it. So if you can get it in while the values are light, it's a good time to do it. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just slowly working my way around the nose, pulling out this, well aware that it's too light at this point, knowing that I'm going to go back to the airbrush next. Now, if you don't want texture, you could just skip the eraser and only use the airbrush. But one of the reasons I like the eraser is that it just gives me so much more room for error. It allows me to fix mistakes. And also while I'm erasing, I'm also getting rid of those pencil lines, which I don't need anymore because I got everything where I want it to be. And before I wrap this one up for today, I just want to go along to this right eye and just pull out a few highlights around it. This way next week, we could paint in the cheek right underneath the right eye. And then from there, we could finish up painting the mouth and the rest of the portrait. And in next week's video, we're going to continue what you're seeing right here. We'll finish getting everything in place like the jaw lines and the cheeks. We'll also add some subtle skin texture across the rest of the portrait. And before I go, of course, I want to say thank you to the generous support of the channel members. I'd like to say welcome and thank you to the 2 newest members who joined this week, both at Tier 2, Rick and Christopher. Thank you so much, guys, and welcome. And thank you to the extremely generous support of the channel members, Jabba, M. Shibli, Robert, Ken, Pete, Dwayne, Carl, Michael, Cyril, SM, Mere Creative, Mackie Mark, Leon, and M-Web. Your support truly makes this channel possible, and I can't thank you enough. So that's it for the first part of this portrait painting tutorial. We'll pick this one up next week and finish it up. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you back here next Friday.